Hi, I'm Darren Winston, head of books and manuscripts at FREEMAN'S, and I'm here with rare document expert Seth Kaller to talk about some of the lots in our upcoming sale of Alexander Hamilton material from John E. Herzog's collection. Seth, what did you find that you'd like to talk about?
Well, so much Hamilton. This is a great collection, and I also just really appreciate what John has done for the study of history of finance and supporting the Museum of American Finance and other institutions. But there's a great grouping in this sale. There are a whole bunch of different things in Hamilton's handwriting, things relating to him. But I'll just start by talking about the one that is from 1794, and it's a letter signed by Hamilton, which means the signature is his, but he was sending these to a number of different collectors at the same time, so a secretary is writing out most of the text. But this is fun because if you think of what $1 million is today, and then multiply by some unimaginable amount to think of this, which is in answer to your letter of the 28th of August last on the subject of the periods at which the Board of Directors contemplated that the interest to become due on the last loan of $1 million made by the Bank of the United States should be paid. I mean, that sum of money when the entire government budget for a year would have been something like that.
Right.
Yeah, I'd have to look at
Boggles the
Hamilton's
mind.
other papers. But yes, that was a significant portion of America's debt. And he's writing to the President of the Bank of the United States, which actually is not like today's Treasury Department. It's not a wholly owned subsidiary of the United States. It's a private company that Hamilton established. And then this is in the day before envelopes had been invented. The address is on a panel, and you see the remnant of the seal.
So the letter
Where it
would have
came
been
from.
folded into an envelope shape and then closed with the seal, and as you pointed out,
Right.
there's the remnant of at least half of it.
Right, and then this is not Hamilton's signature, this is the recipient's docketing. It's their early filing system.
When the document would have been folded back like the way we fold a letter now, standing up with the docketing on the top, so as they're like flipping through a bunch of them, they can see the relevant information.
Exactly. So that's a nice letter, good
Great.
example. And of all the things that you have, I wanted to pick this one because people sometimes wonder, well, what's an original document? And you think about a sign piece, so there's no debate about that. But if you're talking about something like Hamilton's most important works, the Assumption Plan that was passed in 4 or 5 acts of Congress that established America's financial system, the people would have seen it, not on the news and not online, but in a newspaper. And here, this is a Connecticut printing in August of 1790, an act to making provision for the debt of the United States. And what's so amazing about it is the counterintuitive idea. Governments before then, when there's a change in government, at the first opportunity, what the new government does is repudiate the debts of the prior government and just start from scratch and let the investors go screw themselves.
Right.
And what Hamilton did was the opposite, to say, all the states that are coming into this union all have significant debts from the Revolutionary War. So it was money spent for the good of the nation even before it was a federal government.
Everybody paying for their
Yeah.
part. Right.
And he realized that it would draw the country together. It would establish a firm foundation for a new system if that debt could be funded all at once, instead of each state competing against the federal government for funds and maybe defaulting on their loans, or maybe saying, oh, we're not going to pay the old loans. So Hamilton not only agreed to pay the federal government's debts that had come from the Continental Congress, but also the states' debts. And that was great negotiation. There were so many interesting points, but one of the most contentious really was, given that this is 1790, the Revolutionary War was 1775, say, independence 76, through 1781 for the fighting, but 83 for the treaty.
Right.
But throughout that time, you've got citizens, soldiers, business people who are all having trouble with the continental currency that became not worth a continental.
Right.
These men who are fighting are away from their homes and their farms and their businesses, and the whole economy is so screwed up, really, that they end up selling much of the debt that they held, rewards that they got for joining the army and all. They sold for pennies on the dollar to investors, and Hamilton had to deal with the question: how does the federal government resolve that? I mean, should we pay a fraction of the face value because that's what it's worth now, or what these investors paid, or should we pay the full face value? And he argued for the full value, admitting that it was a problem of fairness, but there was no way that they could deal with that. But by keeping the debt, affirming the debt, consolidating it, he said the future debt of the United States will be much cheaper to service. And, it's get political a little bit now, the same issue is here, where if the federal government actually defaults on its debt because of this debt ceiling debate that's going on now, there's no question that it's going to cost us trillions of dollars going forward,
Right.
in additional expenses. I mean, only billions to start, but compound it.
Right.
In additional expenses to service the debt. So he said, if we pay the debt in full, fair or not, it will save us all money and create this firm basis for a new financial system.
Right. And this was, as you pointed out, printing it in the newspaper was the only way to get the message out. And provided you could read and your town or village got a paper, you learned what was happening. And maybe it was your husband or your son or your father that was had incurred those debts, and it's spelled out there.
Yeah, and it's also just a couple facts. Many people don't remember that the first capital of the United States was in New York City. So that's where this Congress is, and that's where this debate happens. And that's where one of the greatest compromises happen also, because a number of the Southerners did not like the idea of letting Hamilton set up this financial plan and assuming the debts if their states had already paid more of their debt than some other states. And so the trade-off was that the capital would move south, first to Pennsylvania, back to Philadelphia temporarily, and then in 10 years to a soon-to-be-built city called Washington. Well, not even called Washington,
Right.
D.C. then, but the capital city.
I think they referred to it as something on the banks of the Potomac. I think they
Yes.
referred to the river, which gave us
Yes.
the location.
The location, right.
But that was the deal. That's the South sort of gave in by getting that in response.
Yeah, and that's all here in the act about locating the capital is not here, but it's part of this negotiation, and
Right.
you could see it in a separate newspaper. And then this is one of the acts that really founded America's financial system, and the estimate is, I think, $300 to $500. So I think original newspapers have tremendous content value, historic value, and if it sells for anywhere near that, also, room for growth,
Exactly.
like the country. Yeah.
And then the document under here,
Yeah.
tell us about that.
So that's a printing of an act of Congress, but in a newspaper, so for the public. But every state had to also get it officially. And the first two secretaries of state were charged with signing an official copy 2 copies actually, of each act of Congress for every state. So this one is from 1793, March 2nd. So by then there are 15 states. So Jefferson hand-signed 30 copies of this.
2 for each state.
2 for each state, even though, and I haven't researched this, there probably aren't any more than 3 or 4 of these known, signed by Jefferson. And the entire act, now we think of acts of Congress that are thousands of pages. This is a fairly important act, and it's just 1 page, signed in type by the president, meaning his name is here to make it official, but then by hand by the Secretary of State. After the next secretary, Edmund Randolph, they stopped requiring the secretary to sign these.
Right.
I just think that there's a lot of power and importance in this original piece of paper. And some collectors may wonder how this can be here and is not in an archive. But this is at a time when very few states actually had rules governing the ownership of these documents. And even the federal government with presidents, the George Washington Presidential Library wasn't established until about a decade ago. But the law changed so that the National Archives actually owns presidential documents, was because of the Nixon papers being sold.
Right.
And so it was after Nixon, they're the property of the government, the country. But back then, the governor would finish his office and then would go home with his papers.
His box of papers.
So we don't know which state this particular one came from.
Right.
But it is safe to say that whichever state it was didn't have a state archive and the kind of rules that
we
they
now
have
see.
now. So at some point after the governor left office, his family, his descendants would have sold the papers. The most that I see on the market are from Governor Samuel Huntington of Connecticut. And we can often recognize his handwriting on the back.
Now, is that why those are so recognizable? Because there's handwriting, which you can see sort of themes running through, as opposed to this, where there's no evidence of what state or what person ever had it?
No, I think it's just a question of how many pages there are. So if it's something that's printed on 3 pages, then the 4th page would still, the back of page 3 would still be there, and so you'd see the docketing. Whereas this would have had a totally separate, it would have been attached with leaf, but then if somebody's collecting, why have this extra piece of paper that
does nothing?
Does what they think is nothing. I like looking at the clues, and
absolutely,
we found some things looking through the sale on some of the other letters about docketing and what it tells us, but we have to look at what we have in front of us.
Exactly. And as we were talking about before, there is quite a selection of documents. And back to John's collecting habits, he bought well. He had a good eye. We have here, is it 7, 8, 9 documents signed by Hamilton, representing different parts of his career, which wasn't that long. I believe the last document we have that's signed by him is it the mid to late 1790s, and he dies in 1803. Is that right?
1804.
1804.
And yes, and he had retired from the Treasury Department.
Right.
But before he left, he knew that his political opponents would be questioning him in perpetuity. So before he left, he actually asked Congress to review and thoroughly audit his books. And he basically encouraged his greatest enemies in Congress to be on that committee. And they did very thoroughly audit the books and were relatively happy with what they found. The other thing that I think is is cool. This is, Hamilton raising money. There's no federal income tax at the beginning.
Right.
So it's through trade. It's collecting taxes on imports, which at the time was also thought to help America's manufacturers. And it is really taxation with representation. And when they found that things didn't work, they fixed it. That's why, when there's debate between Hamilton and Jefferson, for instance, I always seem to fall on Hamilton's side for a number of reasons, but one of them is that Jefferson just was more doctrinaire about these thoughts that he had throughout his life. And Hamilton might have been too, but he was also totally reactive to data. And as soon as there is real life pushback, he's doing the best that he can, trying to develop this really complicated system, and then he finds out that it's not working in this way or that way, and he'll immediately move to try to fix it, not to stay with the the overall idea, but to actually try to make it work. And that is really, the story of all the compromises, all the back and forth, all the gathering of information, even the sort of the beginnings, not of cryptocurrency, but of blockchain. If you think of it, one of the reasons they couldn't pay the original debts, they couldn't track who owned them or how they traded. There were no records, so he created a record system, which is, now we're talking about it being electronic, but back then, even just recording it on paper and keeping it, even after the government issues the debt, keeping track of it, that was progress.
Right. And as you said, progress that we're seeing 230, 40 years later, as you said, with blockchain, it's exactly the same thing. And hopefully we'll see if in 230 years old bits of blockchain have the same sort of interest that old bits of paper that Alexander Hamilton handled do.
We don't know yet, actually. We know that early electronic systems degrade or need to be kept up, whereas the paper, the first 30 years of computing, I know people who had Wang computers, and they thought that data was being preserved forever. And in fact, the paper is going to last longer.
No, exactly. It lasted a lot. It has lasted a long time. It'll continue to. And hopefully, I believe there's 44 lots in the sale that at least, not at least, as many as 44 people might walk away with a piece of historical paper and either start their own collections, add something to the one they have, and maybe add something to the sort of public record. They might have a piece of information that we don't have and hasn't been heard, and so the story continues.
Yeah. The other thing, just another thing to mention for people who aren't in this field already, this paper is acid-free paper. So if it hasn't been framed, it's not going to be faded, and that newspaper will last, for thousands of years potentially, as opposed to a paper that's printed today that's going to start degrading immediately.
Right.
That's what, this is way before wood pulp paper, which is acidic, was invented. So. No,
it's an amazing looking group of documents. The Jefferson one in particular is just astounding, and we know that it hasn't been treated or washed, or it was just looked after. I think it was probably tucked away in a book for a couple hundred years, and
you don't want to, convince people to bid too high on that one, because that's one that I want.
Right. Thanks so much for talking to us, Seth.
Thanks, Darren.
Bye-bye.